All right, so welcome again, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. Really appreciate you joining us this morning, especially as we start gearing up for all of the activity of a new academic year, new school year. My name is Monica Van Bladel. I am Associate Director at the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies here at University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. And I am so delighted to have you all joining us, to see so much interest in this program. We got so much interest in this program. We have wonderful speakers who are going to share just a wealth of resources. And so I'm really appreciative that you're all taking the time. So we are making this recording for our YouTube channel. There are lots of other great talks on there. If you are interested, we have topics on Haiti's independence debt, climate migration, Latin American children's authors. So check that out if you haven't seen it already. And for our program today, we are teaching Latin America with digital maps. This is a 3-session series. We're here Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday mornings, and we're loosely organized by the topics of mapping in Latin America for today, tomorrow, tools and resources for teaching with maps, and then the final session, building a maps unit or assignment. But we really want this to be an interactive conversation, workshop, dialogue, so please chime in. And we are happy to adapt this to your interests and your needs. I'm really excited to introduce our speakers for today. They are very prominent on your screen, and I will be sharing with you their expertise and then handing it over to them. Both are faculty at Western Michigan University. They teach in the School of Environment, Geography, and Sustainability. And we'll start with Nicholas Padilla. He's assistant professor there, broadly trained as a critical human geographer, and his research and teaching lie at the intersection of political ecology, political economy, and indigenous peoples in Latin America. His current work focuses on Colombia. He does ethnographic fieldwork that explores politics and spatialities of indigenous and peasant social movements, education, and economic activism. His colleague, Giulio Pedrasoli, is also an assistant professor in the school. He holds a PhD in geography from the University of São Paulo. His current research centers on assessing changes in Earth's surface using satellite imagery, spatial analysis, and spectral mixture models. Most relevant to our session today, he coordinates the urban area mapping team at the Map Biomas Initiative, which maps both urban and rural land use in Brazil. So again, I'm very pleased to be hosting them today. They're going to be offering us an introduction to their work and these thematic areas in Latin American geography that we can use to guide our own thinking then about how to incorporate more maps and Latin American topics into our own teaching. So with that, I will hand it over to Nicholas and Giulio. Thank you again so much, and please join me in welcoming them.
Well, good morning, everyone. And Monica, thank you so much for that introduction. And Georgia and Anne and Monica, thank you so much for organizing this and helping to bring us together to talk about this. I'm an alumnus of UWM, and I'm always the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies always did right by me and enabled me to do my fieldwork in Colombia a very long time ago at this point. So I'm always happy to help out however I can, even if it's from my dining room here in Kalamazoo. So thank you all so much for joining us this morning. And Giulio, it's so great to see you. I haven't seen him in a number of months as he left Kalamazoo in May to return home. Monica approached me earlier this summer. I think actually in the spring is probably the best way to characterize it, with the idea of how do we think about how we teach about Latin America and the Caribbean and these regions and places where I do field work, and not just how do we teach about it, but how do we incorporate maps into this teaching in ways that make it more accessible for our students. And I was very excited by the provocation, and I was also very excited by the opportunity to think about it, because it's something that I've struggled with for a number of years as I teach classes about Latin America and Latin Americans in English. And it's something I frankly struggle with it, because much of the world of Latin America is inaccessible, and I strive to teach it from the perspective of Latin America and Latin Americans. So this was an opportunity for me to think about that, and I immediately thought of my colleague Julio and the work that he does with Matt Biomas and the work that Matt Biomas does that it has expanded well beyond his focus. So I'm going to take a step back and just, Julio, would you like to introduce yourself to everyone really quickly?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Nick, for this your words. I'm happy to be here. Also, different from Nick, my experience with Latin America is on the ground, mostly on the ground. I lived most of my life in Brazil. I'm living in the U.S. right now, but I'm in Brazil at this very day, right? And most of my experience and the kind of mapping that I'm doing in Brazil, it's related to my own experience and the problems that we face in Latin American cities. So I work with a lot of technology, but I use these tools to teach a lot and try to bring Latin America perspective in my classes also, even in the US. So this is a great opportunity for me, and I really want to share a little bit about Matt work and what I'm doing with it. Thank you, Nick.
Sorry, I clicked on the wrong thing. I'm on my computer that gives me trouble sometimes. So what I really wanted to do is I wanted to situate this idea of mapping Latin America and the things that are going on there. And this is something that Julia and I have talked about a number of times over the past almost 2 years at this point, is there's a long trajectory in history within Latin America of mapping as a tool of dispossession, right? Where during this initial colonial encounter, and this is something that I emphasize in the course on Latin America that I teach, which is an upper level general studies course that I'm working with. It. Most of my students are not geographers or students in sustainability studies. They're coming from all over the university. So this upper level general studies course, the big thing for me is, as Julio even just highlighted, right? It's teaching Latin America from the perspective of Latin Americans. So in the beginning of the class, I spend the first couple of weeks emphasizing how maps, ever since Latin America was created, post 1492, after Europeans arrive and give it this moniker Latin America, or this moniker the Americas emerges, and then Latin America to reflect the cultural heritage of colonization. Right? Maps became this tool of taking, right? And geographers like Bill Denevan and others have spent a long time thinking about what does it mean when geography was used as this colonial science to take, right? To portray this world out there that was terra nullis, that was vacant of all people, and was simply available for taking by Europeans. So early on, geography was this discipline that served to erase Native Americans, indigenous peoples, Amerindians. It doesn't matter what the title is that you give them; they're all people who were native to these continents, and to enable Europeans to create this collective imaginary of this thing that was out there that could be taken. Right, so maps in the earliest form on the Americas were designed to take away and to assign ownership to Spain, to Portugal, and to other Europeans that were later arriving. But in the intervening years, maps have also become this tool of resistance to counter these all-encompassing hegemonic discourses, right? These governmental narratives of this land over there that is vacant where we can send colonos or these other people who can go occupy this territory. Right. So what we've seen emerge, I would say in the last, Julia, please correct me if I'm wrong here, but I would say 30 to 40 years where maps have really become this tool of collective resistance against these discourses of there's nobody out there and this land is vacant. Was I right? 30 to 40 years? Okay. Good enough. So what I'd like to situate the way I think about this and the way that I think about maps in telling the story of Latin America is in the classroom. I first used them to communicate to the students that maps took. Right? They were designed to erase and make this land available. But in the intervening years, as social movements around Latin America, whether it's MST in Brazil, the Landless Workers Movement, or it's an indigenous organization like the Regional Indigenous Council of Colombia, pushing back and using maps to say, oh no, we have a historical claim to these territories. Right, so some of the earliest movements of this would be collective mapping, or in Spanish, mapeo colectivo. And this is people coming together and simply placing their stories on the maps, or even gathering oral histories from community members to say, oh, was this, was this your family's territory prior to colonization? And through that, gathering enough stories where they could use maps to speak back to their governments and say, hey, we have a claim to this territory. You need to award this to us in our communities, right? Some sort of protected indigenous territory. And later on, even and more recently, I guess we could say counter mapping, this collective effort of using a map to tell a story from below, right, of the marginalized communities and excluded communities. So for me, as a geographer teaching this course, that is a geography course, I try to situate mapping and within it, the context of Latin America, first taking away and later allowing people and enabling people to assert some sort of ownership over these places and make claims. I've already talked more than I hope to talk, so I'm crushing it so far. I do absolutely I want to have conversations, so you are welcome to shut me up at any moment in time and interject with any questions or things that aren't clear. And I'm happy to have conversations more than just lecturing. I was just telling Monica and Anne and Georgia before we started, I've been teaching this summer, which has been a fantastic experience, but my throat is tired. My voice is sore and tired most of the time now. So the way that I think about and approach mapping in my class that I really wanted to emphasize today is thinking about mapping as a tool of resistance, right? Mapping as a way for these marginalized communities to make claims over territory. So I wanted to frame this a little bit by talking about what I do in class before we get to the mapping. I'm sorry, I have too many windows open. This is the academic's dilemma. Within my class, we have a section of a couple of weeks where we're focused on extractivism, right? The idea that Latin America has been this place where things have been taken and sent abroad for quite some time, really since 1492, right? It's Columbus writes about it in his journals as his lust for gold is deeply apparent. Sorry, Cristoforo Colombo, right? Not Columbus. We'll use his real name. So this is a multi-class session that focuses on extractivism, and I do my best to tie taking of gold and silver and all these other ores and petroleum to this colonial endeavor of finding resources for the benefit of outsiders, right? So we read a bit of Eduardo Galeano and the open veins of Latin America. And the students hear the Uruguayan perspective, or a Uruguayan perspective, I should say, on how extracting resources was the foundation of colonization, and it's something that continues. It continues almost unbridled today in 2025. So we focus on that theme of extractivism, and to do so, I like to show videos as best I can. So we have a couple of assignments. The first one, I've used a couple of different ones. How many of you are familiar with the film Crude, the documentary? I see a lot of heads shaking. Okay. Or there's another one. Did you raise your hand, Julia? I'm sorry, I was looking away. I thought I saw a hand go up for a second. So Crude is a 2009 documentary that's focusing on petroleum exploration in Ecuador and how it unfolded across the 1960s and 70s and accelerated. These government wells were sold off to Chevron in Texaco, what was then Texaco, became Chevron Texaco. And the legal fight from communities in the Coca, Ecuador area to have their lands cleaned up after there has been all of this resource exploitation. So I'm going to share my screen really quickly just to show. So this is the wrong video. I got to switch to the other one really quickly. I can. There we go. This is Crude. It's generally available. We use our library's website to watch it. Interesting story of how these communities came together to fight back against what happened. Oh, this is actually the wrong Crude. Perfect. This is the one, the real price of oil, the story here that's looking at that. And it's an awful story, but it's also a familiar story of what happens when petroleum exploitation takes over these areas. So the students will watch this movie, and I have them complete a worksheet that's asking them questions about what happened. What are these communities fighting for? So again, as I've said, I really try to emphasize this idea that Right? We want to incorporate views from Latin Americans and Latin America to help us understand what's going on in these particular places, because that is often beyond the reach of my students because they don't speak, read Portuguese, Spanish, French, Quechua, Aymara, Mixtec, any of these languages that would be instructive and help them open up and access these worlds. And it's a relatively long video. They are often shocked at what movies look like in standard definition, and that's something that I frequently hear. How did you watch this? How did you live like this? And they will also complete a worksheet to help them think about what this extractivism looks like as they're watching it. And I have that I'd like to share with you all as well. So here, right there, I give them a little context. Of course, an academic wants to talk and fill the world with all of their words and ideas. And we're just getting them to think about what's going on, right? I want them to think about not just what petroleum extraction looks like. They have a very easy time of understanding that petroleum produces economic benefits, right? This is a story that we've been told, right? Why is Texas a wealthy state? Why are the universities so well funded? Why do they exist with no state income tax? Well, because they've been able to exploit petroleum for their benefit, which allows them to reduce taxes in other places. So they're really comfortable with this idea that there's an economic benefit to exploiting mineral resources, but they're much less comfortable with this idea that there are consequences that we must think about as we begin to look at these economic endeavors, right, and these exploitations of these natural resources. So here, I mean, this is what the worksheet looks like for these students. And you can see that there's only 7 questions about the video itself. And then I have these other questions that there's to answer for the next class session, right? I want you to come prepared next time to think about this. What does this case tell us about economic development? What about this fight between Texaco or Texaco, as they call it? Why is it happening in the United States versus in Ecuador? There were all sorts of getting them to think about scale and these problems of environmental degradation when they transcend international borders. This is one example of an assignment that we do on environmental degradation and extractivism. Right? And here I try to link this to environmental justice, right? This idea that ecological degradation in the global south or in places like Ecuador is what we could call the ecological debt, right? That is what we owe these developing countries because this was taken from them, and what we left was death and destruction and took money, or really rotten dinosaurs, that is petroleum. So right here, I'm getting them to engage with these ideas and think about this. And I just wanted to do this with a couple different videos. Crude is one that I kind of stopped watching just because the main lawyer who yes, absolutely, Laura. The main lawyer who's involved in this legal battle, he has been arrested and he is now currently incarcerated in federal prison here in the United States for racketeering, I believe, or some sort of RICO case. And I just find him kind of grating. It's just his personality I don't really enjoy. So I've stopped watching this, and I find that the students, they just kind of lost interest in the story of petroleum. So I then wanted to, I have a couple of videos that we watch. The other one that I've been using for the last couple of years is They Come for the Gold, They Come for Everything, or Vienen por el oro, vienen por todo, it's a film about Argentina and the construction of a gold mine in Western Argentina. And I'm happy to share these links with you. I'm also happy to share these assignments and the worksheets that I use. So I can, Monica, I think I can get those to you and we could perhaps share those with everyone.
Will do.
Awesome. You don't have to use them. I don't care if you do use them, but they're there.
Nick, there's also another question for you in the chat.
Oh.
Indigenous movements related to this petroleum extraction.
Yeah, so I do talk a bit about the Shuar and the work that they're doing and how they frame their resistance to petroleum exploitation and environmental degradation within their own indigenous worldviews, right? It's not just environmental degradation, but it's the destruction of, I mean, as it would be translated into Spanish, well, I guess it's Quechua and Spanish put together, Pachamama, right, or Mother Earth. This idea that it's not just this, the Earth isn't just this reserve of natural resources, but it is this living thing in which humans are embedded. So I do my best to in a relatively quick way, talk about how these indigenous communities respond to this, and try to do my best to faithfully talk about their worldviews as shaping their resistance. And also, I mean, we talk very specifically about Ecuador's ugly history with racism, right? Where indigenous peoples are the ones that are frequently subjected to these sorts of environmental degradations, right? It's not an accident that all this petroleum exploration happened in indigenous Amazonia. So I do talk about the Shuar and their struggles to accomplish some sort of legal change in the Ecuadorian courts, and how and why that has failed, and then why we have a discussion about how it moved into U.S. courts as a way to seek some sort of redress. Does that answer the question, Luce? I can't see you, and I didn't see anything pop. Oh, I see you now. There you are. Okay, thanks. I've got too many things that I'm clicking on here. It's a great question, and I think it's also really important because it really, when we think about how this has played out in among indigenous communities in Ecuador, for example, which is different than the case in Argentina, it really helps the students engage with these colonial logics of race and how they were transplanted into the Americas and into these new countries that were formed during the colonial era, and what has emerged post-independence, post-18. I mean, South American independence is 1821 through 1830, more or less. It's a pretty quick period, or a pretty short time period. So, great question. Thank you so much. Happy for more as well. Second one is they come for the gold, they come for everything. And this is the construction, the relatively recent construction of a massive gold mine just west of, or just outside of Esquel, Argentina. This one, the students get upset about because the movie's entirely in Spanish, and they have to read subtitles, and that's okay. And so this movie's a little bit shorter, but they get a sense of what is going on in this particular location. It is a massive industrial gold mine that will be it's the open pit mine. I'm sorry, it was only coming up in Spanish, and I didn't want to do that. But it's an open pit mine where they're essentially going to blast the top off this mountain, and they will just put tons of rock dust into these massive crushers that will just mine this. They will take this dust, they will crush it, and they will pull out molecules of gold, more or less, and refine that into large chunks. It is obviously environmentally very destructive. It will involve the use of cyanide. I believe that's the one. I should have looked this up before talking about it. It's cyanide or arsenic. I feel very, very comfortable that it's cyanide, but I could also just have cassava stuck in my head because I talked about it in class yesterday, which will then damage all these lakes in this national park that exists, the lakes that exist in the national park just outside of this gold mine. So it examines this community conflict that emerges in the community of Esquel as they come together to vociferously push back against this. And I just wanted to share I wanted to pop into this other assignment really quickly. Just see the worksheet that I used to talk about this. Here it is. I really did my best to have all these tabs organized. I was like, I'm gonna be so prepared. And then now there's like 6 tabs open. So every time I try to find a new one, I'm looking, I feel overwhelmed. So again, here you can see, right, the video is relatively long. I do my best to frame this in these larger examinations of what we're talking about in the class, and how issues of ownership, who accesses the gold and where the gold goes after it's pulled out of the mine is really important here, because it matters that this is it's a foreign mining company that's coming into Argentina to exploit these resources, which means not only is the gold leaving, but also the wealth is leaving, and all that's left behind is environmental degradation. So getting the students to engage with what is Esquel like as a place, who lives there. They have to do a bit of surmising. They really have to pay attention across the video to get a sense of what this community is like. It's very far from the capital. It is in southern Argentina. It is kind of a tourist town, and it is relatively isolated, and it is relatively underdeveloped within the Argentine economy. I asked them to think about the conflict and what's going on here. Sorry, the formatting's a little goofed up here. You see there's some spaces I'm missing. and getting the students to then engage with these stakeholders, right? As I've said a couple of times now, I really want them to think about this from the perspective of locals. Right? Students in my classroom, as I've already said, have a really easy time understanding the economic arguments. Oh, we'll invest this much money, we'll take out this much gold, and it'll generate this much income. They don't struggle with those concepts. That for them, it's as logical as putting peanut butter and jelly together between bread, right? Like they're two things that just fit together. But to engage in an empathetic way with why is it that people are so concerned about these gold mines and what they're going to do, start to get them to think about, who are the stakeholders here? What are their concerns? Some people are in favor of it, but many people are against it. And then here as well, these other questions to think about as they return to class. So those are the two. I mean, there are other assignments that I pulled up in a couple of other worksheets, but I don't feel like going through those. I mean, they're just other things that think about economic development and how we can problematize it. So in this example, right, we have they're thinking about extractivism, what happens when resources go away, who benefits, and what happens with what remains, right? I'm trying to get them to engage in a critical way that encourages them to think from the perspective of, this feels trite, but I would say everyday Latin Americans, right? That is people who will experience some of the benefits of economic employment, but they will also be left with those environmental consequences of lakes that are full of cyanide or arsenic, and or in the case of Ecuador, these former sort of overflow pits that are just essentially bubbling, nasty, disgusting pits of petroleum that are just sitting there mixed in with other chemicals that are leaching into drinking water. And they're these people who live around these pits have elevated rates of stomach cancer, esophageal cancer, of cardiac disease, of all these really preventable, unnecessary health outcomes that are directly linked to living within this environmental degradation on a daily basis and simply drinking that nasty, disgusting water. So I'm going to stop sharing for a second here. And I wanted to pause and see what questions you all have for me, things that I can elaborate on in, I promise, a very succinct manner. I'm also accepting compliments if, if anyone just wants to throw something. All right, cool.
I I
Go ahead.
just I was just going to say that this has been so helpful already because I teach Spanish in high school, and so it's helpful to see some of the resources that you've been using with your students. And I don't know that I would be able to show such a full-length movie with the attention span of my students. I have to break it down a little bit, but it's helpful to see how you've been thinking about framing the discussions and developing the students. Like helping the students deepen their thinking around the issues. And so I just wanted to say thank you for the Spanish resources and for this really comprehensive discussion of the issues. So compliments.
Oh, all right, good. Thank you, Laura. That's I'm happy to hear that. So I see a couple other things popping up in the chat. Happy to share anything with you. And like I said, we'll get you everything I can. And right, for me, the big thing is, and I tell my students from day one, I want them to empathize with Latin America and the position of Latin Americans, because I find when they start the class, right, where I do a sort of pre and post, right, like what do you know about Latin America? What does life look like in these places? I ask that I do that the first day of class and toward the end of the semester, I think the last week of class, and right at the beginning, right, they find it really easy to say, these people over there, they're poor, that they're backward in some way, they seem to be suffering. And then at the end, right, they have a much closer connection, right? They seem to recognize that they see humanity in them, right? They're like, oh, they're just regular people like me who are just trying to get through life and confront all of life's challenges. So, let's see, Harriet, are my students concerned about the environment? Ours are. Yeah, our students are very concerned with the environment. Julio, have you noticed that in your classes and what your students? We teach different things. We have different foci academically, but
Well, they mostly are. Well, my approach is a little bit different because I'm using remote sensing and satellite data, so we can see more in a larger scale. This problem is happening everywhere, but they're concerned, but they don't have a good understanding of what's the relationship about how the exploited countries in Latin America are suffering from it, partially because of the US and other parts of the world. So the connections are the biggest point that it's hard for them to grasp at the beginning. So this is where I work the most, the connections, because to see it, it's kind of clear in the images.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. It's we can see that, I mean, even if you were just a simple thing like satellite imagery to map, right, roads expanding through the Amazon and how that correlates with wildfire encroachment. And then we could even start to map human environment conflicts, right? Habitat degradation, right? It's these sorts of things become really clear to see. Um, and I would say that our students are generally concerned. I think there's part of that is a positive selection, right? Those who attend universities and colleges are also not predisposed, but right, they continue their education because they recognize that environmental degradation exists and that there are all sorts of wholly preventable consequences, right? That is, we don't need to be burning coal and live next to that, and then also have people who have elevated rates of asthma, chronic pulmonary issues, and heart disease, right, that are common with living around those sorts of known environmental pollutants, or those being exposed to on a daily basis. Yeah, so Carrie, I see your comment as well. This is a huge component of it, right? That in many cases across Latin America, absent focused ongoing governmental invention, it's left to communities to do things. In many cases, that is intentional, right? What we've seen in Mexico with the scaling back of the Mexican government and its capacity since the Mexican peso crisis of the early 1980s, right? As the government has been forced to make itself smaller and sell off its assets, they've essentially made themselves less capable, right? They can write laws to protect foreign investment, and they can buy decommissioned U.S. military equipment to fight narco trafficking. But beyond that, Mexican civic institutions and Mexicans are the ones who are left to fill in where the government has failed. So, but we can also in that context talk about how these sorts of movements happen in response to failures of the government, and they attempt to hold the government to account, right? Saying you must do better by us. Yeah, Monica, I see that comment, right? We certainly have plenty of Mexican Americans in Michigan, but our student body is significantly different, right? We have a large Muslim population. We are an access institution. We are pulling students from the east side of the state, right? So Detroit-ish, and also getting a lot from Chicago. We have surprisingly a large segment of Dominican students who have come to Kalamazoo. I think it was in the 1980s, the president of the university set up a partnership with the university in Santo Domingo. So we have surprised me when I encountered my first Dominican in Kalamazoo that we have a large Dominican population. So I find a similar sort of, they see a lot of similarities between the struggles in particular locations, but being able to engage Latin America from different, the Caribbean from different perspectives is really enlightening for them, or opening it. It's an aperture. Let's see. Yeah. So, Kristen, right, building to consider the impacts of industrialism development in a local area, who's most impacted, and what are those impacts? Yeah, right. It's right. I really. Oh, I see that. Thank you, Monica. I agree. Right. I my best is to I do my best to make sure that these struggles are not foreign. Right. They're just things that we also feel and recognize and see here in North America, because they're they find it easy to exoticize and romanticize those sorts of things, right? Oh, this place over there where all these victims, but it's much more complicated. So connecting it to life here, I think, is much more productive. So thank you so much for that. Luce, go crazy.
Thank you. Yeah, no, just building off your last comment about victimhood. So I know that a lot of these extractive corporations are located in the US and in Canada and in the global north, for lack of a better term. But what I was sort of wondering is how much do you focus on the partners these corporations have within Latin America, right? So like the Latin Americans who are very active in promoting extractivism, or even Latin American governments, be it Bolsonaro in Brazil, or Milei in Argentina, or, it is not like, how do you make it more of a complicated narrative as opposed to the big bad global north and the victims in the global south?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it is, I think that nuance is really important because I don't want to in any way reinforce an incomplete narrative that, oh, we're stealing everything and they're just victims, right? You're absolutely right to point out that there are so many players across Latin America who are deeply invested and committed to making this possible, right? Whether it's, Rafael Correa and his government that was very much focused on the politics of buen vivir, or living well, right? We will exploit resources to invest in social programs, and he's been convicted in absentia for his corruption, right? Stealing millions of dollars from the Ecuadorian government and enriching himself off contracts. So we, especially in the case of crude, right? I 100% talk about that, right? Where it's not just Texaco, right? But it's Texaco in partnership with Ecuadorian politicians and also local community members. The reality is in lowlands Ecuador, in the Amazon, in the Oriente, in the Napo province, in Coca province, there are absolutely people who want more petroleum extraction. They're indigenous communities who say, we want this because they recognize that there are material benefits. So I've taken students to lowlands Ecuador, to the Napo province a couple of times. I'm hoping to do so again in the relatively near future. And communities all up and down the Napo River are happy to have the oil companies come in and put in wells because they get new roads, right? They now have asphalt roads, or tarmac roads. They have 5G wireless throughout where they live, right? So they're on Facebook and TikTok. By the way, if you have a chance, Quechua Instagram, fantastic. I love it. Indigenous social media is so cool. They have brand new schools. They have brand new soccer fields, right? They have health facilities that are being funded by these companies. And some of them get jobs as security agents or as truck drivers for these companies. So that allows them to send their kids or their grandkids to school, or to finish building their house, or to buy a boat, right? All those sorts of things that are really impactful. So, Luce, I really love the comment, and I do my best to be as nuanced and faithful and fair as possible, right? Where it's not just the big bad North, right? I Am Gold, the Canadian company, coming in and stealing, or actually Meridian Gold. I Am Gold was the Argentine sub company, right? Yeah, sorry, ran out of words in English there. Their subsidiary. That's it. Yeah, that's a great question.
Thank you so much. As a final resource on this topic of petroleum extraction and alternative energy sources in Latin America, I'm putting in the chat a link to an article about solar power coming to indigenous communities in the Ecuadorian Amazon. Our center, about a month ago, hosted a teacher institute where we spoke with this reporter who talked about his reporting on these alternative energies as a form of community empowerment. And I also wanted to share that if you are not familiar, the Pulitzer Center for Crisis Reporting has a lot of great free resources for educators on how to incorporate these stories on underreported stories across the world into your teaching. So those are two resources. And at that point, we're about halfway through. So I don't know if there are a few remaining questions for Nick, if you could put them in the chat, and then maybe we'll be able to get to them as we wrap up towards the end. But
yeah, and I'm sorry, I wanted Environmental Justice Atlas is another great thing where you can get those stories from these communities, and this is where I hope to culminate. But I'm terrible with time.
Drop the link in the chat.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's right there, and it's again, A lot of this is in Spanish, but as much of it is in English. Right? This is another student. I asked the students to go to this website and actually find other environmental conflicts and start to think about them. Right. So this is this mapping resource where they're not just in Latin America. So if you teach about other parts of the world, North America, the Asian, Pacific, Africa, it's all there. It's a great resource, and students can see what communities are saying about what's going on there. The end. Thank you.
Hi, I am a K-8 ESL specialist. So I work with multilingual learners who are learning English in Wisconsin, and they come from all over the world. And so one of the things that I was really excited about regarding this series was how to use maps, and you just touched on it, Nicholas, use maps to find the parallels across the world. So what you're describing in Ecuador and how that would be the parallel in Malaysia, for example. So I'm excited to check out some of these resources. Thank you.
You're welcome.
And I think with that, Julio, we would love to hand it over to you and hear you talk more about your own work.
Yes. Yes, sure. Thank you. Congratulations, Nick. Very cool presentation. And I have some questions to ask you after that, but I will start by sharing my screen. I have some slides to show just to help me to go through what MapBiomas is actually. And after that, I can show a little bit more about how to use the maps and what kind of approaches that I employ to use the maps in my classes, but it can be adapted or it can be used in different contexts, playing a little bit with the scales. So MapBiomas is a platform where we put the maps that we produce. I will talk a little bit how we do it in a minute, but I'm the one responsible for the urban mapping in Brazil. We are not mapping only Brazil, but I'm mapping the entire Brazilian territory urbanized area. And this picture right here on the first slide is something that maybe some of you know. It's a very famous picture from a Brazilian photographer called Tuca Vieira from 2005 that shows the Paraisópolis slum on the left, right in the side of this very fancy building with the pools here, and it went famous all over the world. And this is a little bit about, this is the image that we have about what kind of differences Brazilian cities can show us. But there's not only bad things about slums. I will talk about more about slums with you in a minute. Just from more let's say company perspective, this is MapBiomas. So MapBiomas is not an university or an institution. It's made of a lot of partners, so including universities, NGOs, startup technology companies that came together to produce land use and cover maps using satellite data from the 85 to today. So we produce every year a new map and put together and make them available, and we can extract a lot of information about it. We have some support, money support, and also other kinds of support that it makes us keep running the project. So nowadays, MapBiomas is mapping not only Brazil, but all the countries in Latin America. So I am responsible for part of the Brazilian MapBiomas, but we have maps being done locally by teams from the countries that learn how to do it, and they choose their own classes, then put together their own algorithms to make the classifications and satellite images. Also Indonesia, that is the fourth collection already, I think. But we are expanding probably next year to Democratic Republic of Congo. India is already on training this year. So there's some colleagues of mine there right now helping them to put together the maps. And Mexico probably next year will be joining the club, so making the map. So there's a Latin America all about Latin America is inside of it, of MapBiomas platforms. You cannot explore everything now, but it will be able to do it in like 1 month. We're putting together all the maps in a single place, and we are working on that. But basically what we do is we have a time machine that is the satellite images. We can look at the past and we can compare and see what changes over time. Not only Brazil and the entire world, but we focus on Brazil. And all the images are made by small squares that we call pixels, the small parts that make the image. And we can tell the story of every pixel. So every pixel have a story, and you can tell over time what is happening to that pixel. And you can see the changes over time. Because it's too big, a lot of countries, a lot of people working together, we can't do it by using our hands or just interpreting images in a visual way. So we need to employ machine learning and artificial intelligence. So we train the computers, and the computers express the patterns for us and put together the maps, and then we validate, we check if it's correct or not. And because there's a lot of countries doing it at the same time, a lot of people working on the same data sets, we work with what we call cloud computing. So it's a fancy name, but it's just a computer somewhere. In this case, it's the huge computers inside Google infrastructure. So we use one tool called Google Earth Engine. Then we don't need to download the images. We just keep the images where they are, and we build some fancy codes, and we send there, and the computers make the work for us. So we have a lot of computer power to process this image. So basically what we do is to build an image for the entire Brazilian territory every year. And then we train the computers to classify it. We give them some samples. Oh, this is urban, this is water, this is mining sites. And the computer learns and produce for us one map for every year. And then we integrate all these maps together, and we can see the changes, what we call the transitions. Because one thing are the maps, and the other things that are the coolest part of Mapiomas is that you can see what happens with the Brazilian territory and recount the history over time using the maps. So the transitions, deforestation, what is happening with the vegetation, mining sites, like Nick said, we know exactly where the mining sites are, how fast are they growing close to indigenous lands or not. So there's a lot of information that we can extract from these maps to understand the land use and cover dynamics that is important for a lot of stuff. Planning for the government, for us as citizens to understand what's happening to our country, the size of it, and other stuff. And there's one specific thing that's urban expansion. This is what I'm doing. So basically, you can think about Mapiomas is something that helps us to look to every pixel. In Brazil, we have 9.88 billion pixels to cover the entire Brazilian territory. And for every pixel, we can see what's happening over time. So for example, one pixel could be a forest at some point, and then like in the Amazon, and then they put some fire on it and become agriculture, and after that pasture land. At the same point, it became an urbanized area, and we are able to see what's happening with it over time. And this is the first tool that I actually used a lot in my classes. That is what we call time lapses. This is a very interesting way to see what's happening. It's just looking how things are changing over time. And are the very same images that I'm using to process and classify in Mapiomas. That Landsat data is a US satellite. There's Landsat from 73 to today, and you can see what's happening over time. So when I talk to you, we can look at the history of every pixel. This is what I'm talking about. We can see what's happening with every small part of the Brazilian territory. From that, because we are managed to make the maps, we can understand the basic stuff. There's much more that I could talk to you about it, but I will talk a little bit the basic things that we can extract from this map. So for example, we know, looking into the maps that we produce, that 0.5% of the Brazilian territory is made of cities, which looks like it's not a lot, right? But Brazil is huge. It's almost the same size of the US. Of course, US is bigger if you count Alaska and Hawaii, but if you're not looking into that, it is about the same size, right? And there's 10 times more soybean plantations in Brazil, for example, than cities in area. So this kind of data that we can extract, and this gives us a different perspective on how the territory has been occupied and changing over time. But anyway, from 85 to 2023, well, more than double the amount of urbanized area in the Brazilian territory. You can see the difference in the maps. And since we have where the urbanized areas is located, and we can calculate the size of each one. For example, another information that I can extract it is the difference in growth rate comparing big cities, medium-sized cities, and small cities. So the big cities are not growing that much every year because they are growing like the sky rises and different stuff. But if you look into the small cities, the pace of growth, it's way higher, almost double, right? So the small cities is growing a lot, and this start to raise from a geographical perspective a lot of questions. What are the systems going together, like the transportation system and sewer system and so on? So we have small glimpses to understand what's happening to the Brazilian urbanization, and we can see what the history of the urbanized area in Brazil. So the urban pixel, it was something else in the past. So basically, most of the Brazilian urbanized area came from pasture lands. It was forest at some point, and then in the surroundings of the city, it became a pastoral area that was waiting for the right time, getting value, the right time to become a urbanized area, right? And this is basically the history of the Brazilian urbanization, that it's very simple, that nobody knows prior for we do it and show it in the map. So this is basically what we do. But in the Brazilian case, not only in the Brazilian case, but it's common, very common in the Latin American cities, there is a very specific type of urbanization that we call slums or favelas in Brazil, that it will be the same. There's a lot of different definitions. There's the global one that the United Nations gives us. So lack of tenure, lack of access to water and sewer and other stuff. So these are the areas that I usually define to my students in a very simple way. So imagine when you move to somewhere else in a city, what happens is the city goes first. So the streets, the houses, and the water, and then you move, right? The city was there, the infrastructure was there, but after that, the people moved to that place. The slums are the opposite. The slums are self-built. So the people don't have other options. They occupy some land, and after that, somehow the city needs to go there. So after people are living there, and then you need to start to think about water and transportation and all the other stuff. So it's the opposite way, but it's a very interesting way to occupy, because there's a lot of solutions emerging from there. I will talk a little bit about it. So in Brazil, especially in Brazil, the pace of urbanization, the growth of slums in Brazil is higher than the pace of growth of the general urbanized area, for example. So basically what I can tell you, for every 4 years, a slum area equivalent to the city of Lisbon in Portugal appears in Brazil in the last 4 decades, which is a huge area. So that 0.5% looks like it's not a lot, but because Brazil is so big, this is a huge number, right? And this is a very important characteristic of the Brazilian cities, because some of the Brazilian cities, and some very known ones like Manaus, that is, and Belém, Manaus and Belém, the capitals and the Amazon, more than half of everything that grew in the urbanized area from 85 to 2023 were favelas or slums. So this is not something that it's small, or not something that it not depicts the city. It's part of the city. It's how the Brazilian cities, especially the capitals, are made of. They are made of slums, right, in a huge proportion. And since we have all these data sets, and this is what I'm going to explore a little bit with you, we put together in different platforms, and there are one that I love so much, that is the urban data platform that I'm building together, and I will show you how to access it and some ways of explore it, to to look at the maps, to understand the dynamics of the different the Brazilian cities. And the same thing will be available for all the other cities in Latin America. Not now, but like I said, in a few months, we're going to put together the same data sets inside a huge platform, and we're going to update it every year. So basically, you can access it, but I will send you the link later. I will just now very briefly show you how you can find these data sets and some of the ways that I explore with my students, that it can, maybe it would be useful for you. So if you go to Google and you just search for map biomas, the first thing that you can find here is Map Biomas Brazil. It's in Portuguese. You can click on it. And probably the first time that you open it is still in Portuguese, but now we have this magic button here that is the English translator. You can click on it, and then way easier for you to find things here. Well, the information inside of it, it's not translated yet, but at least the menus are translated, and it's easy for you to find the things that you can use inside of it. So there's two things that I will show you. The first one, it's very simple. You can go here into download section, click, so maps and data, downloads. There's a lot of things here, but there's one that for me, it's very important to use in class that I'm using a lot. That are the infographics that we produce. That it's like the abstract showing the different teams that we are working inside MapBiomas, and organizing in a way that we can explore the different information. So you can look into the entire Brazil and see how the land use land cover as a whole is changing over time. You can look into different biomes. You have 5 different biomes: the Amazon area, the Pampa, the Pantanal, Cerrado, and Caatinga. Right? I can't explain all of them right now, but there's a different parts of landscapes in Brazil. So the Amazon is the one that everybody knows. But we have all what we call the cross-coding teams, because Amazon is in the Amazon, Pantanal is in the Pantanal, but cities are everywhere, water is everywhere. So we need maps that cross-coding all the other teams. So for example, Nick was talking about mining. We have the most accurate and most recent data on mining in Brazil, for example, to understand it from a different perspective, where the mining sites are, what is legal, what is illegal, because there's difference between industrial mining and what we call garimpo. The garimpo, it's usually illegal, and it's usually related to a more handmade thing. It's not using machines and so on. As you can see, for example, this is a very useful way to teach about a little bit of how the mining sites are distributed in Brazil. You can see that most of it in area are in the Amazon area. You can see here, almost 70% of all the mining sites in Brazil are in the Amazon. But the most shocking thing is how it's growing over time, right? And you can see the difference between what is legal and illegal. And the illegal part of it, it's growing faster, for example. This is something that you can use. Going back here, so this data sheets here, from my perspective, are very useful from a didactic standpoint. It's easy to use, and I use it a lot of my classes. But you can explore the data also in a more dynamic way. So here in the same menu, maps and data, you can access the platform, and you have you have access to this link, MapBiomas Land Use and Land Cover platform. You can click on it. And then if it's not in English already, there is an English option here at the left bottom. But in my case, it is English right now. I can access it. And this is basically what we produce. So this is the land use land cover for the entire Brazil. And you can actually see the distribution of each type of land use land cover for one specific year. So like I said, it's a time machine. We are looking into the map for 2023, but I can go back to 85. Here you can see on the bottom, and I can see the difference. Hopefully the internet will help me. Yes, you can see the difference between 85 and 2023, and you can look at it all the years. So this is another thing that I use a lot to show how the dynamics of the territory is changing. Of course, if you are a more technical user, you can download the data itself. You can look into the raw data. You can download it and apply your models and make statistics, whatever you want to do with that. But this is one way of using mapping data. You can actually filter it by country, by different types, like biome, state, city. So you can look very specific data for very specific places, like cities. I'm not going to explore everything here because I will explore a little bit more the MapBiomas urban data platform. That is very similar, and everything that you can do inside the urban data platform, you can apply here also. So if you look into the left part of the system here, there's a lot of small icons. So temporal analysis, deforestation, secondary vegetation, pasture lands, fire. We map all the fires occur over time in Brazil. So how many times, I love this number. So for example, in Brazil, 20% of all the Brazilian pixels or all the Brazilian area burned at least one time in the last 20 years. That's the kind of numbers that you can get from this. But in the very bottom, you can find the urban platform. It's a better version. It will be better in the future, but it works right now. I will click on it, and then you have access to this new module that is the urban data platform that I will explore a little bit. So I will start exploring it, looking in a city, for example. So instead of looking into the entire country, that you can see for the entire country, inside the cities, how much of each urban, land cover type we do have. So 20% of the Brazilian cities are still covered by forest, 35% are actually urbanized area. You have farming inside the cities at the limits, the legal limits of the city for the entire Brazil, but I can go here from country to city, and I would choose a city that I know a lot because I lived there for a while, more than 10 years. That is Salvador de Bahia. Salvador de Bahia. Here. And you click on it. The map, you zoom on it, and then you can see the details, what is happening here. So for Salvador, for example, in 2023, we have 66% of the total area urbanized. If you go back to 85, it's 32, so almost double. So you can compare both years, right? So you can see how it was, how it is. It's a very simple tool to use, and I love to use it with my students because they can understand the dynamics and so on. But there's a very specific thing here that I really love, that this is this point information. Like I said, every pixel have a story. So if I click in this point information and click in everywhere in the map, you can see the history of this pixel in all the years. So of course, I click in an area, there's a very old area of the city. So it was always urban, never was burned over time, always urban. I will go close here, but if I go, for example, in the outskirts of the city, in the places that I know that it was way more recent urbanization, and I click in this point, sorry, here, and you're going to see a very different story. So as I said, this is the history of the Brazilian urbanization. It was a forest at some point, and probably between 1992 and 1993, it was deforested by some reason, but it was not became urban already. Someone started to do it to keep the area ready for use, and then it's a very recent area. It became, this specific point became urban in 2023. So this is a very cool feature because people understand very easily, the students understand very easily what is happening here. And we have also other information here, including the one that I want to explore a little bit, that is the slum locations. So I also mapped all the slums in Brazil. So we have about 13,000 officially located slums in Brazil. We have way more than this number, but this is what I could compare with the official data. So it's our officially recognized slums in Brazil. All the capitals, but in more than 700 cities, we have slums located. So if you go here, and you can see the legend by census tracts, and you click on this legend view by census tracts, you can select different things. So HAND stands for height above meters drainage. That is a model that we created to estimate the flood-prone areas. I'm not going to explore it here now because it's more related to risk and these things. Slope, risk, all this, these layers can be used to understand what parts of the city are connected to climate emergency. But there's another one, the last one, that is the slum locations. When you click here, and you can see inside of the city, in these orange areas, all these orange areas are the slums. So you can see for Salvador, for example, about 40% of the entire territory is a slum. This is a huge area for the city. In São Paulo, it's a little bit more. Rio de Janeiro, it's a little bit less. Rio de Janeiro is a little bit less. Manaus and Belém are more. It depends on how much money the region have. You have this correlation, right? So this is a poor area. And if you zoom in, this is a very well-known slums. I went there several times, a lot of it, every week. making field work here is called Vale das Pedrinhas, right? A huge slum in Salvador. And to analyze it a little bit better, the first approach that I use with my students, okay, but how we know that this is different from the rest of the city? How the computer learned the difference from this satellite perspective? The easiest way is to use the opacity. So I will apply a little bit of the opacity, and then you can visually understand what is the difference between this area and this area. So it's way more compact. The roads and the ways that you can use the connectivity, it's way different from this rich area surrounding. So there's a reason for why the computer was able to recognize this as a different way from, as a different feature from urbanistic standpoint, right? There's more complexity to it. And you can see that most of the areas, they will show similar characteristics. So a lot of slopes, very compact, mid-rise constructions. And I will visit with you a very specific area that I was working for a while, last like 2 years, every week visiting the area that is Alto do Cabrito slums. Because what I usually do, what I often do with my students, is to explore the combination of scales. Okay, there's a limitation here and the urban data platform from MapBiomas, and it's shocking for some students in the US when I start to talk about slums and showing the pictures and why it's important to discuss it, because it's not something that it's usually, it's very different from the US cities, how they are made, how they are built, and so on. But okay, but it's looking from a satellite perspective. Perspective is maybe it's not enough. So what I usually do is, okay, I can use MapBiomas data to approach from the satellite, but let's take a walk inside this slum. So I can go to Google Maps and I will search here for this specific slum called Alto do Cabrito in Salvador. And we'll zoom in. This is Alto do Cabrito in Salvador, basically. But we can also walk a little bit inside of it. I will just use the street view for us to understand what is this. So this is Alto do Cabrito. The first thing that people ask me, okay, so the streets are not that bad. Okay, you can walk here and so on, but remember, the Google car was able just to went through the major roads. So this is not the real inner slum. So all that we can do is to walk around just using the main roads, not the small roads. So if I start to walk inside the slum, and the second thing that students ask me, okay, this is ugly. This is a pile of trash here. And this is what we call Viela. This is the real street. So the inner slums is inside of it. So why the trash is here? And then the first question that I ask for my student is this the problem, or this is actually the solution that they found to deal with the problem? As you can see here, there's no car that can go. There's no garbage truck that can go to pick the trash. So actually you're gonna find this pile of trash everywhere, not because they don't know what to do with that. It's because this is a system designed inside the slum. They grab the trash and they put it in some place where they know the garbage truck can pick it. If I keep walking here, you're gonna see that this is very common. So yeah, you can see another one here. Can you see here? This is the logic. So actually, this is a solution that they found. So there's a lot of things emerging from here that can teach us. Of course, it's ugly. Of course, it's not the best solution. Of course, it's unsupported most of the time, but it's the solution that they have. Another thing that I usually explore with my students is the slums teach us a lot about the mixing possibilities of the urban space. So if you look into all these streets, they are all mixed uses. There's always a small store. There's always something happening in the commercial use, or in this case, a tire shop, everywhere. You can see it everywhere. And people are walking around. So the way they build it and the way they mix the uses inside the slum make it walkable. You can walk around. You need to walk around. You cannot use the car for most parts of the slums. And this creates a very interesting contrast even for me, on how the US cities are built. When I moved to the US, and I realized after a while that I can't live without a car, it was shocking to me because I was living right here, not in this specific slum, but close to this and going to this place every week, basically. And I was used to live like this, right? And so this is actually a good thing. If you mix together and you make the places walkable, and this is the solution that I made, right? They created inside. There's a lot of other kind of solution for climate adaptation in the houses, if you look into it, but this is more from an architectural standpoint. So you need to look beyond the ugly part of the slums and to understand what the Latin American cities can offer in terms of solutions also, not just for Latin America, but for outside. And this is something that it's overlooked, I think, in the US and most of the world. And I try to use this kind of images to understand the geographic space from a Latin American perspective. Of course, the Brazilian cities are not just like this. They are beautiful. They have beautiful places. If you go to Rio de Janeiro, they are wonderful places. But this is an important part of the Brazilian urban structure that I usually explore. I think I will stop here. I will just give you a little bit more aerial perspective of this area that I'm showing you. Some of the videos that I made there, and sometimes when I went back there, just for you to understand the scale of it. When you look into the map, you have no idea how big Alto do Cabrito, this land that I was showing you, is. It's a sea of people. It's a big area. It's not just a small patch. So you can see in the background, the city, all the high-rise buildings, the fancy ones, but it's a huge area. And you're looking from above, you have no idea how complex and how many solutions they develop inside of that system, right? Just for you to have an idea of the area that I was walking a little bit inside the maps with you right now. Well, of course, I can give you access to the videos. I have tons of videos like this from different slums in Brazil, and I can have you access to the data sets or to the maps, and I can show you more detail, but I will stop here. And then we have some time to discuss if you have something to ask. Let me just stop to share my screen. If someone could help me. Yes, I found it. Thank you.
So, Julia, that's so fantastic. Thank you so much. I always love hearing about your work because it makes me jealous that I'm not that kind of scientist. And it's always exciting to hear what you're doing. And I really love this idea that you went through this these sort of multi-mapping methods, right? That we can sometimes access the Google Maps Street View, but we can also see the satellite imagery. Those are 10-meter pixels. Is that correct?
There were 30-meter pixels. We have
30
meters also, but it will be basically the same.
Yeah, and it's this idea that we can write a picture every single year for 30 years, right? Or 40 years. I'm sorry, forgot the 80s, but 40 years ago. We can really demonstrate, right? Oh, look at what's happening, and look at how quickly it's happening within these places, and right, and also the structure of Latin American cities is profoundly different than anything that our students are likely accustomed to, right? That is that the favela, the toma, the slum, whatever you want to call it, that informal settlement is it's a necessity. So thank you so much. I love it. And I'm working on designing an assignment based on map biomas. So this is great.
Thank you. I got the compliment. Got the compliment. Thank you. Well, I don't know how many of you visited a slum before or know more about slums and how they work. But if you have the opportunity, taking all the care you need to, it's a wonderful experience. And people living there are really, really smart. And I can tell you.
Julio, I'm surprised. Buenos días. Julio, I'm surprised you didn't talk about what they do in the favelas with the trash, instruments and desks and all the productive ways that the community have found to use trash to help the community?
Oh yeah, you mean the recycling things and so on. So this is basically the way they built everything, most of it, because it's self-built. There's just looking into the images, there's a lot of characteristics that I was not able to explore. So for example, why there's 2, 3 stories in each building? Partially because they have mixed uses, but partially because it's a family tradition. So if the son get married, so they build another store, and then another son get married, they build another store. So looking into the buildings, you can tell the story of the family sometimes, and even the buildings are recycled. So this is another, and now I'm working with a Colombian professor that is a professor at the University of Colorado Boulder, Professor Jota Samper from Medellin, and he from architecture and urban planning, and his work focuses in these solutions also. And he was working in slums of Medellin, showing how the materials that when you like you break a building and he reuse the materials to build another one, it never left the slum. So it's a very different way to use the material. So including the recyclables, so it's a source of income to them in most of the cases. There's a lot of problems. I'm focusing on the good side of it. We know about the problems, but this is not my focus right now. But you're right. The way they use the materials teaches us a lot about how we can use in a better way, because they build it with their hands, all that stuff. There's not much material coming from outside. They use everything that they have inside.
Gracias.
Stephanie Maloney, go ahead with your question.
Thank you. This is just fascinating for me. I'll be teaching AP Language and Culture this year, and I really want to mix up the way the units are designed for AP to try to make them more current. And something you just said about the favelas, I saw that in Peru as well, that in the poverty-stricken areas, you know, like you said, the family adding on an additional floor for each new marriage. Do you see, and I know it's a tremendous amount of work, do you see adding other countries into the mapiomas in the next decade or so? Or is this focused predominantly on your expertise, your area of study? Or will you have other graduate students help you build it? Something along those lines? Because this is very, very exciting, and our kids who are game oriented would thrive on this. They would be completely engaged in this platform.
The plan is to be present in 70% of the tropical countries by 2030. So there's some funding come from the Terry Audacious project. So I'm talking in behalf of Mapiomas, but I am just one among 500 working on this project today because of the different countries. So I'm working in Brazil, but there's Mapiomas already happening in all the Latin American countries, Chile, Peru, and Bolivia, Colombia, and so on. The favelas itself, I am working together with Argentina because they have a slum data set already, and we can use it to create similar approaches into them. But I'm trying to put together with the local teams, because they need to decide. It's not up to me to talk about Chile. It's up to Chile to decide. It's not up to me to Argentina. But we are working together to have all these details in all the platforms. I have access to slum data sets also in Africa because of other projects. So probably Africa will go that deep also. The African countries will have the same kind of detail in their maps regarding to urban areas, including slums and so on. But yes, we are expanding, and we hope to cover from the south to the south by 2030, 70% of the tropical countries. Let's see if it's going to happen, but it looks like it will. Okay, there's a student from Federal Rio Grande do Norte De Natal, muito bom. I went to Natal once. I'm missing it.
You two, on top of being such a wealth of information and resources for all of us, have been impeccable with time management. We have 2 minutes remaining for our scheduled session. So we have time for one more question or comment, if any of the participants want to jump in. If we do not have another question or comment, I will take the opportunity to thank both of our presenters so much. I cannot believe how much I learned in these sessions. I am so grateful that you shared your expertise with us. I know beginning of August, as I said, is a busy time for all educators. And so thanks to our participants for coming in and for bringing, again, that active teaching perspective of how you see yourself adapting these topics and these resources to your classrooms. I think it's helpful for all of us who are here to hear different use cases and help brainstorm. So thank you again, Professor Pedrosoli, Professor Padilla. Really appreciate your time. And for the rest of you, I hope to see you again tomorrow and Thursday. We will have 2 UW-Milwaukee library staff specialists to teach us about more resources and tools for building assignments and units to zoom in on these thematic topics, build on these resources, and help build out a longer unit for our classes. So thank you again to everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Thank you, everyone.